Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Pei Bet, Shavua Tov, and wishing everyone a safe day today. This week's learning is sponsored by Medina Korn in loving memory of her mother, Rosalie Kachin, Shoshana Rezel Bat Avraham Yeshua V'Beila Toiba, Zichrona Levrachan, her 24th Yortzeit. She had a notem ba'ayin yafa approach to her interactions with everyone she encountered. She was generous of heart, of mind, and of spirit, and we miss her. Yehi Zechra Baruch. Today's stuff is sponsored by David and Mitzi Geffen in loving memory of David's mother, Ethel Petagorsky Geffen, Adina Bat Aryalev, on her 20th Yortzeit. She was devoted to her husband, family, and the Bethel Synagogue community in New Rochelle. Her two sons made Aliyah, and her daughter has lived a professional life of service to the American Jewish community. Today's stuff is sponsored by Ayala Ginat in loving memory of Barak Ben Lipa and Shulamit. We'll get started. Just a reminder that the journey for Rosh Hashanah is starting today. So if you haven't yet registered, you can still register. You can still pass it around to people. You can get started today. We can probably get started a day late. Anyway, it's a great way to prepare for Rosh Hashanah. So Avigal Gross-Gelman is going to be helping guide the program. She's available for questions, and she's giving introductory videos to every daf, and then the dapim will be the dapim that we learned back when, a few years ago, from Rosh Hashanah. We are going to now get started with our daf. We ended with this issue. We started a Mishna which distinguished between someone who buys two trees, who does not acquire the land, or one tree, and Rabbi Meir who disagree, but let's leave Rabbi Meir aside right now. Two trees, you don't acquire the land. If you buy three trees already, you acquire the land. Today we're going to get more into the details of that, how distant do they need to be, and what exactly do you acquire. We'll get to that. And before that, we're going to finish up right at the very beginning of class with the Bikurim sugya. So we saw the sugya in Bikurim, which also talked about the two trees and the three trees. And if you buy three trees, then you acquire the land, and then obviously you bring the Bikurim and you say the Mikra Bikurim. But if you buy two trees, you don't acquire the land, and then you can't say the text of the Mikra Bikurim. But you do bring the Bikurim, you just don't say the text. To which the Gemara said, well, why do you bring the Bikurim if you don't bring the text? You don't say the text. And then they said, well, it's really that we're not sure. Maybe you acquired the trees, but because we're not sure, we make you bring the Bikurim, but you don't say the text. And we said, well, then how are you yotze if you didn't say the text? We dealt with that. And then we said, right, you have to avoid it by doing it some weird way where one person picks and the other person brings it, right? And then you'll avoid the obligation. To which the Gemara says, Amarle Rav Acha, for second line of our daf, Bereg Rav Avia Rav Ashi. Why don't, if your whole concern is you don't want to bring the Bikurim, right? Also, by the way, we had to do this Safek Hekdesh, right? You do this, well, maybe it's Hekdesh, maybe it's, because otherwise you have to worry about Truma Matzir. Came up with like a very weird way that you have to do it, that it kind of complicated. Also, you could say cumbersome. So he says, I have a better solution. Michte psuke ninhu likre. Instead of the last thing that we suggested, trying to avoid the whole problem by having one person pick it and a different person bring it, and that way you won't be obligated in the Kriya. Why don't you just go to the temple, bring your Bikurim, right? Okay, you still have to do, maybe it's Hekdesh, maybe it's Bikurim, and then you have to bring the Truma Namasrod and all that. But, right, on the off chance that maybe it's really not Bikurim. But he says, why don't you just open a Chumash when you get to the temple, read the psukim. He says, Mirte psukim inu likre. It's just psukim in the Torah. So open a chumash in the Beit HaMikdash as if you're learning. You can always just do that and read psukim from the Torah. Okay, where do we do this, by the way? Coming up. That's why I thought it was good to mention it. When you say slichot, you can't make it to shul and you don't have a minyan, so you can say part of the slichot on your own. There's certain parts you can't say. So one of the things you're not allowed to say by yourself is the Yud Gimel Midot. So the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, I believe it's in the Shulchan Aruch, I forget, or I don't remember who says it, but you can, there's a solution. You can open a Chumash, read it, or even just not even open a Chumash, but read the Psukim with the Ta'amim, the way you'd be reading from the Torah. And then it's as if you're reading Psukim in the Torah, and that's how you can do it without a minyan. So, same thing here. Why don't we just read the psukim, and then we don't have to do this convoluted, do this, do that, have someone pick, someone else bring it. Just read the psukim. Amarle. So we're going to have two possible answers. So the first is Rav Acha B'Reit Rav Avia had asked Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi answers the first answer, which is Mishum Demechse Kashikra, because it looks like you're lying. Because you're coming into the temple and you're reading this text and you're saying that I brought from my land that God gave me, but it's not really from your land, or it might not be from your land. So, it's a very nice solution. The Yugim Umidot, it's not like you look like you're lying when you read them from the Torah. This looks like you're lying because you're saying, you're reading the Bikurim that say, I brought this from my land. And it's looking like you're talking about the Bikurim that you just brought, and that doesn't look right. Different answer. We want you to make some sort of noticeable difference so that you remember that you have to take Truma to Masra from it because it might not actually be Bikurim. So if you do it in the normal way, even if you're doing it through the solution of reading it from a Chumash, still you might accidentally forget because you'll kind of be in the mode of, oh, this is Bikurim, and then think that you're exempt from the Truma Maser. So it's to avoid some halachic problems. So one is just the way it looks, and the other is to actually avoid a halachic problem. Now we're moving back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said, Higdilu lo yishapen. That's really not the part that's interesting us, but it's the continuation of the Mishnah. The Mishnah discussed a case where I buy 2 trees. I don't acquire the land. So first of all, if my trees branch out too far, you can't cut them down because basically you didn't give me rights to the land. So what you gave me, since I didn't own the land, you basically are allowing me to use your land. So you're allowing me to use any of your land, which means that if my trees branch out into your space, doesn't matter, you can't cut them down because you gave me rights to use your land, right? Not to buy the land, but yes, to use it for the purposes of my trees. But the continuation is, what if something grows out of this tree? So if it grows from the roots, it belongs to the person who owns the land, which is the person, the seller. If it belongs, right, the seller of the trees. If it comes from the trunk, it belongs to the person whose tree it is, who bought the tree. So how do you tell where it's coming from? It's sometimes hard to figure out. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan, here's our way of figuring it out. If it sees the light of the sun, meaning it's above ground, then we call that coming from the geza, from the root, from the trunk, belonging to the tree owner. If it doesn't seize the sun, then zehu min hashorashim. Then we consider that coming from the roots, right? Like everything. You have to have the cutoff point. Where exactly, right? Where it might be unclear. So now they ask the question, if we say anything that sees the sunlight, what if? That means basically if it's above ground, it belongs, let's say, in all of today's stuff, I'll be the tree owner and you sold me your land. So if I own the tree and I own anything that's above ground, well, we could have a situation where I could trick you if we go by that. Lichush dilma maska aras sirton. Why aren't we worried that maybe, right, well, say it grew from this area above the ground and it's mine. But what if some wind blew a lot of dirt and mud and all that, and it gets covered, but it's mine, right? Because it was growing from above the ground. And then, now imagine I have a tree with roots sprouted in different directions. And now there's a whole growth coming from it. And now the bottom part is covered and you can't see where it's coming from. And let's say it grows in 2 different directions. Now, over time, what can I claim? I can claim, look, I have 3 trees here. And that means I get all the land underneath. So he says, right? Right. So maska aras sirton, that means the ground could get covered with dirt and mud. And then and then I could claim, look, I own 3 trees here. So why aren't we worried about that? Why do we give me anything that comes out of the trunk that might actually get covered? And then I'll claim, oh, look, these 3 are mine, because they really are mine, right? Because they came from the trunk. But now that they got covered, I can use this and flip it to claim something that's not true. Allah Amarav Nachman Yakotz. V'chein Amar Rabbi Yochanan Yakotz. On account of this question, Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yochanan changed the meaning of the Mishnah. And they say when it says Ha'uleh min hageza is mine, doesn't mean any growths that are sprouting from here we leave intact and they're mine. Because I really could trick you then. I could even theoretically cover it with stuff and then claim it's all mine. So we make me cut down any growths from the trunk. But what does it mean they're mine? Well, it means whatever I cut belongs to me, but not that I could keep it growing and then end up with 3 things that look like 3 separate trees and then all of a sudden claim that I own the land underneath. Okay, so they totally different. It's a totally different interpretation of the Mishnah than we had before, because it didn't say cut it down. It said they're mine as if I could keep them. Now we learn I can't keep them where they are, but I can keep them once I cut them and use them for firewood or whatever I might want to use them for. So we have two sections so far where it's going to be a bit disjointed today. I'm going to jump from topic to topic. Some of them connect a little, but first topic was the Bikurim and why we don't have the solution. Instead of coming up with a crazy solution, one person picks, one person brings, why don't we just say, read it as psukim? We answer with two answers. Then we had this, what is considered, how do we know where the line cuts between shorashim and the trunk? We explained that, but then we said there's some other problem with giving me the trunk, so we changed the meaning of what the Mishnah said. Now we have Amar Rav Nachman again. Rav Nachman comes and says, Naktinan dekel ein lo geza. Okay, I'm going to preface this section by saying that there's many interpretations of what this section means. There's even different versions of it. It's very complicated to understand in a simple reading, and that's why there's so many different interpretations. Each one has some weakness. I'm going to go with the Rashbam, okay, so as not to confuse you too much and not to start opening a million different interpretations, but there are many. If you want to follow them, you can read commentaries and see. But we're going to just stick with the Rashbam, even though I'll point out what some of the weaknesses are in the Rashbam's commentary. So Rav Nachman says, Naktinan dekel ein lo geza. Now, the Mishnah said, if something grows from the trunk, it's mine, right? The owner of the tree. But Rav Nachman says, again, reading it the way the Rashbam reads it, dekel ein lo geza means if it's a palm tree, though, there is no such law. The roots, things that sprout out from the trunk do not belong to the owner of the tree. So what does this mean and why? So not only the commentaries have trouble understanding this, but in the time of the Gemara already, they didn't really understand what he meant. So we're going to have two interpretations. One is Rav Zvid, then Rav Papa is going to say this doesn't make any sense. And then Rav Papa is going to answer what Rav Papa thinks Rav Nachman meant. And then the Gemara is going to say, well, how did Rav Zvid understand it that way if there was a difficulty, and then try to give the way Rav Zvid would explain it. So some Rav Zvid L'Meimar, he thought to say, Ein lo geza lebal dekel. Why? This is the way we explained it, that anything that grows from the trunk doesn't belong to the owner of the palm tree. Now, what do we learn about a dekel? That once it dries out, again, this is the way the Rashbam is understanding this, once it dries out, what happens? So we said it doesn't regrow, okay? So therefore, it doesn't mean a dekel, okay, just to be clear, I see someone wrote in the chat, it doesn't mean a dekel doesn't have a trunk. It doesn't have the law of a trunk mentioned in the Mishnah, that if something grows from the trunk, it goes to the owner of the tree, okay? Which means what? It goes to the owner of the land. If my tree, I bought a palm tree, it started sprouting growth from the trunk, those sprouts belong to the owner of the ground, not me, even though, right, the Mishnah said, anything that comes from the geza goes to me, the owner of the tree. So Rav Nachman says there's an exception to the rule with a palm tree. That's the way Rav Zvid is understanding it. Ein lo geza lebal dekel, dekevan de lemichpar, which we didn't explain yet, we're going to understand it right now. Lemichpar u'lisharesh chai, asuche masach date. Since this tree will likely, okay, now here we have to add something. We said that if a dekel is cut, right, it doesn't regrow. Whereas most trees, you trim them and they grow better. A dekel tree, and once it dries out, you can always cut it lower down and it'll grow again. Not with a dekel tree. So because of that, when I buy the tree, I know that soon it's going to dry out. And then we're going to basically, lemichfar lemishrish, that means we're going to dig it out and take it out. And, maybe I'll use it for wood, but that's it. It's got a short life. Okay, now, it's a little hard to say because just because we said once it dries out, it doesn't regenerate, doesn't mean it has a short life. It's a part of the weakness, right? We see palm trees last for many years. And I have some outside my house that are really tall, but, they also don't have dates on them. So I don't know. I don't know enough about them, but it seems a little difficult to say this. But we're going to go with the Rashbam anyway, because like I said, each commentary has problems. So since it's meant for that, when I bought the tree, I wasn't really thinking long-term, things will sprout from here. Because in any case, I assume soon I'm going to uproot it and take it out of the ground and just use it for its wood. And therefore, I never really had my mind on the sprouts that might grow, in which case I kind of gave up my rights to them when I bought it. I wasn't intending to acquire those. And that's why they belong to you, the owner of the land. And we've learned this before, that when you make a sale, what your intention is and what you intend to include in the sale, not include in the sale. So with a palm tree, it's just different from any other tree. That's what he thought to say. But comes Rav Papa and says, Matkefla Rav Papa, V'ha konesh shnei lanot, to the michpar l'mishrosh kaimeh, v'katane yesh lo geza. Again, hard to understand exactly what this question is, and people take issue with the Rashbam on this because they say the Rashbam's explanation before I even tell you, but it's really right. The Gemara would have said in other words, but the way the Rashbam reads this is following. If the Mishnah says, if I buy 2 trees, which theoretically, okay, let's just put it now in parentheses, like for example, if it's a decal tree, it might dry up, but yet the Mishnah didn't distinguish. The Mishnah didn't say some trees yes, some trees no. The Mishnah said any trees, I acquire anything that grows from the trunk. So since the Mishnah made this very blanket statement, even if it was l'michpar l'mishrosh kaimeh, it sounds like v'katani diyesh lo geza. The Mishnah said anything that grows from the trunk belongs to me, because the trunk belongs to me, I get anything that grows. So why would we make this exception with the decal tree? Okay, he's just saying, well, the Mishnah doesn't seem to distinguish, so why are you adding this distinction? So Ela Amar Rav Papa understands what Rav Nachman said differently. Okay, again, this was all Rav Zvi trying to think what Rav Nachman said, and basically Rav Papa says, that doesn't seem like the simple reading of the Mishnah. The simple reading of the Mishnah seems all trees, owner of the tree, anything that grows from the trunk goes to the owner of the tree. So I don't know why you make this distinction. Just because l'michpar l'mishrosh, it should be irrelevant. So Elam Rav Papa ein lo geza l'bal dekel lefisha ein motzi geza. He says it's not an issue of what was my intent when I bought it, but more like the reality is that a decal tree doesn't produce sprouts. Things don't sprout from the trunk. So then what are we talking about? The ein lo geza? Well, what we meant is, since it almost never happens, okay? There's a 99% chance when I buy a decal tree, nothing is going to sprout from the trunk. Since that, right, you all know a decal trunk is very different from other trunks, right? There's no growths on it. So since it's not likely for it to happen, therefore it wasn't included in the sale. But if something did grow, then it wasn't included in the sale, because no one ever, now it is a little connected to what Rav Zvi said, that in the end it wasn't part of the sale, because I bought a tree that had there was no expectation that anything was going to grow from there, and therefore it wasn't included in the sale. Okay, but because of the reality, the difference in reality, and that's why the Mishnah just wasn't relating to the decal, because it's very different from all other trees in this way. And that's why it's not included. So now they say, Rav Zvi kasha matnitin. How do we deal with the fact that Rav Zvi doesn't seem to match the Mishnah? What was Rav Zvi thinking? To which they answer, which again can be understood in many different ways. And this is also, I think, a big weakness in the Rashba. But what he says is the following. If I buy a decal tree without mentioning any amount of years, so the assumption is it'll probably dry up quickly. That's how we said the Rashbam in general, right? That the Rashbam thinks it'll dry up quickly, in which case I had no intent to acquire anything that would sprout from it. But if I bought it for 5 years, what does it mean? If I buy a decal tree for 5 years, now again, I don't get the land underneath, which usually means if it dies, I can't put anything in its place. But if I bought it for, it doesn't matter, 5 years, for any period of time, a particular period of time, what I'm doing is I'm buying the rights to use this space for that amount of time. So if I bought it for 5 years, if the decal tree falls or dries up and I remove it, I can put a new tree in its place, which means that since I did it for a certain period of time, and even if it dries, I'm acquiring rights to continue having another tree there. Therefore, we assume that I acquired anything that might sprout from it, because since I bought it for a specific amount of time, I assume that even if it dries, I'll put something else in, and therefore there might be things that would sprout. Okay, that's what Rav Zvi thought. In the end, Rav Zvi anyway is rejected, but that's a way to explain possibly Rav Zvi. And then Rav Zvi was talking about in a case, right, the Mishnah talking about Chamesh Shanim, whereas if it was for not any amount of time, then, right, that again, the Mishnah is the Geza that you would get the rights to because you bought it for 5 years. And Rav Nachman was talking about if you didn't buy it for any sort of amount of time, then you wouldn't get the Geza. and then they were kind of Rosvi wasn't trying. The way Rosvi understands Rav Nachman is that Rav Nachman was talking about a different case than the one mentioned in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah includes dekel because it was bought for a certain amount of time, and therefore you did include the sprouts in your sale. Okay, that's again, it's a very hard sugya because it's very hard to understand exactly what the sugya means. And like I said, the commentaries all have interpretations, but each interpretation has some weaknesses. And like I said, some people have a different girsa entirely, but we'll leave that aside. Kanash losha kanakar. If you acquire 3 trees, all of a sudden you get the ground underneath. Now, question is, we're going to have a few questions to understand, like let's clarify what we mean here. So the first clarification question is vikama. How much do you acquire? Okay, so I have the 3 trees. What land do I acquire? Just said I acquire the land, but how much land? I don't get the entire field, right? This is 3 trees in a bigger field. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, remember he's going to quote in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Let's talk for 1 minute outside because we're going to get to Rabbi Elazar, who's going to ask a question. Rabbi Elazar was a student first of Shmuel. He lived in Babylonia. Then he goes to Eretz Israel and he becomes one of the main students of Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, this is Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat. He's the Rabbi Elazar that appears in the Gemara all the time, the Amora, and he ends up being a student of Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan makes this statement: Hareza kanat tachtehen ubeinehen v'chutz alahem kimelo ore v'salo. Okay, moving now to Amud Bet. He says the following: you acquire the land underneath the trees. Okay, meaning here's the tree, everything underneath, meaning the roots. So like that's what we said. If whatever grows from the roots, in this case, will belong to the owner of the tree, because the owner of the tree owns the roots, the ground underneath, and the ground in between all 3 trees. Imagine a triangle, let's say, right? We draw a triangle between the 3 trees. And in addition, you get this other part. Now, this other part we're going to see is treated a little differently because I am the landowner of all the land in between. Okay, we're going to see later, there's a question. I can plant there. I can do whatever I want there. But what about this extra? Now, what's this extra? Melo ore v'salo. Ore is a fig collector. Someone who goes to pick figs, and the salo is the person's basket. What this means is, since you get the land in between, we're also going to give you some space to walk around the tree in order to pick, right? Because if we just said in between, it doesn't include much land on the sides of the tree. It includes the land below, underneath the tree, but it doesn't include the land around each tree that's outside the perimeter of that circle. That triangle that we said, right? Imagine 1 tree, triangle, but you get a little extra space outside there to walk around to be able to collect your fruits. Okay, sounds reasonable. Now this sounds a little similar. Okay, Medina in her dedication reminded us of the mocher ba'ayin yafa, noten ba'ayin yafa, generously stingy. Well, it's a little similar to an access route, right? Because what does this mean? We want you to be able to access your fruits, to pick them. So we'll give you a little extra space. So when they sold you the 3 trees, in addition to getting the land in between, you also get a space around. So comes Rabbi Elazar, Matkifla Rabbi Elazar. He attacks Rabbi Yochanan's position. Says, Hashta derech einlo, dara acharitehi. Now, he assumes you're not getting an access route, right? When you buy 3 trees, you don't get an access route. Why not? Because you acquire the land, which means it's now my field here, your field all around me, and I bought a field. Now, just because I bought a field doesn't mean I bought an access route to get my stuff in the field. So if I don't have an access route, by the way, I skipped 7 words, okay? They according to the Bach, they should be in parentheses. You'll see why in a minute. So I'm going to go back. Since I acquire this land, it's basically my field and your field, and I don't have an access route through your field. So I'm going to get an access area around the tree. Like if I don't even have an access route to get there, why would I be able to get an access route around the tree? Now, this seems to be like he holds like the rabbis, the mocher ba'ayin ra'a mocher, right? Because he's saying when you sold me the trees, you didn't sell me an access route. Rabbi Akiva would say, you do get an access route, right? So it sounds like he holds like the rabbis. That's one thing we're going to infer from here. And it also sounds like, because he added the words da'arach ritehi, because I own this land and you own the field around me, I don't have an access route because it's 2 different property owners. So the first thing we're going to infer is Amar Rabbi Zeira, Midivri Rabbeinu Nilmad, from what Rabbi Elazar questioned Rabbi Yochanan, we can understand that shloshahu de'ein lo derech, that if I bought 3, since I now acquire the field underneath, it's my field, your field, I don't have an access route. But hashnayim yeshlo, this is an interesting comment, but it's totally parenthetical, and then we'll get back to Rabbi Elazar. He says, if I buy 2 trees only and I don't acquire the land, then it's not like I have land here and your land is around me and I don't have an access route. No, I would specifically have an access route. Because you sold me 2 trees that are in the middle of your property. And therefore, since I don't own the land underneath them, you obviously must have given me, just like I can, now let's think about it. When I own 2 trees, I don't own the land, but yet I'm using the land because why? Well, my trees are getting nutrients from your land. So basically, what have you given me? You've given me the 2 trees and the rights to use whatever part of your land I need for my trees. So both I'm going to get nutrients from your trees, and when I want to pick from my trees, I'm going to be able to walk on your property. And therefore, also, I get an access route. Okay? So that's something we infer from Rabbi Elazar. Okay, that's one thing we infer. But as I said, there's something more important that we're inferring, which seems to be that Rabbi Elazar holds like the rabbis, because Rabbi Elazar assumes, and again, let's just be clear because it's a little bit tricky here. Rabbi Yochanan, quoted by Rabbi Bar Abba, said, okay, you get the land underneath, the land in between, and you even get this extra area. And comes Rabbi Elazar and says, how could you get this extra area to pick if you don't even have an access route? Because basically what he's saying is the area to walk around the tree to pick is basically like an access route because it's giving you access to your fruits. So if you don't get an access route, because we hold like the rabbis, then you shouldn't get the Orev Salo. To which Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak comes and asks Rava the following question about Rabbi Elazar. It's like people discussing some other's opinion. Amalei Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak leRav Lema Rabbi Elazar leitli de Shmuel Rabbi. But wait, Rabbi Elazar learned with Shmuel. Does he not hold like his rabbi? What did Shmuel hold? Damar Shmuel halachak Rabbi Akiva damar mocher b'ayin yafa mocher. He says that Shmuel holds we pass him like Rabbi Akiva. Somebody sells generously, sells the access route, like in the bor vidut case, right? The pit, the cistern, you get an access route. So what's Rabbi Elazar saying? You don't get an access route, and therefore you don't get the malo or Orev Salo. But Rabbi Elazar should hold like his rabbi, and his rabbi holds like Rabbi Akiva. So why wouldn't he assume you get an access route, and therefore has no problem with the Orev Salo? To which Amar Le Rabba says, it's not really Rabbi Elazar speaking according to his own opinion. He really holds like his rabbi, Shmuel. But when he read the Mishnah, he said there's no way to understand this Mishnah like Rabbi Akiva, which we'll try to explain in a minute. And I say try to explain because in the end, we're going to reject this. And in the end, we are going to say, just to keep you focused on what we're doing here, right now, we say, how could Rabbi Elazar have asked this question? That question presumes that he disagrees with his rabbi. In the end, we're going to say, oh yeah, he actually disagrees with his rabbi. But right now, we're going to make an attempt to say maybe he really doesn't disagree with his rabbi. And he really holds like Rabbi Akiva, but he was trying to explain the Mishnah. Hanash, right? You buy 3 trees, you buy the land underneath them, and the Orev Salo, and then comes Rabbi Elazar and says, well, according to the Mishnah, you don't get an access route, so how could you claim that this Mishnah is according you the rights for Orev Salo? And now we're going to have to prove why the Mishnah can't match Rabbi Akiva. And it doesn't have to do with this line, the Mishnah has to do with a different line. Mimai, midikatane, how can you not explain the Mishnah like Rabbi Akiva? And then basically we're going to say like this. The Mishnah follows the rabbis, which is what Rabbi Elazar was talking about, according to the rabbis. But he happens to not agree with that position. He holds like Rabbi Akiva. Oh, whoops. Sorry for that break. Had a power failure. I'm going to go back. I can't remember exactly where I was up to, but let's just quickly start where we're up to. So Shmuel had said, right, Lema Rabbi Elazar delayed the Shmuel Rabbo, right? Sounds like Shmuel doesn't hold like his rabbi, who says, halacha, mecher b'ayin yafa mocher, to which Amar Le, lo mechugma manitin Rabbi Akiva. The reason is that he couldn't explain the Mishnah like Rabbi Akiva. Mimai, from where do we get this from? In other words, the Mishnah must be like the rabbis. That's the way Rabbi Elazar was explaining things, according to the Mishnah. But Rabbi Elazar doesn't hold that way. Mimai. From where? Midikatani higdilu yishapeh. Now let's think about the Mishnah. The Mishnah, a totally different line, said if you acquire 2 trees, then once it goes right too far out of range into the other person's stuff, they can't cut them down. But if you own 3 trees, which then means you own the land, if it sprouted out too far, they're allowed to cut it down. Now let's think about it. If you're going to read the Mishnah like Rabbi Akiva, why should they be able to cut it down? Wouldn't you say the mocher is mocher b'ayin yafa generously gives you rights for your trees to be drooping into their territory? So the Mishnah clearly doesn't hold like Rabbi Akiva, which then explains Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar was explaining like the rabbis because he was trying to explain the Mishnah, even though Rabbi Elazar himself doesn't hold that way. And then Rabbi Elazar fits perfectly with Shmuel. And then kind of argues with Rabbi Yochanan based on the Mishnah, but not because he really disagrees. To which, this was Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak's explanation to Rava. Rava retorts and says, I don't think so. Rava says, Amarle, Imurda, and that's, I can explain the Mishnah like Rabbi Akiva also. And then you can't say that the reason Rabbi Elazar took the rabbi's approach was just because he was going with the Mishnah. But no, he actually holds like the rabbis because he could have explained the Mishnah like Rabbi Akiva. Why is that? Because in this Yishapeh, when you can cut the branches off, Amarle, Imurda, Amar Rabbi Akiva, Gabe Bor Vedut, Dilo Makashe Ara, Gabe Ilan, Mishamatle. When Rabbi Akiva said that about Mocher B'ayin Yafa was in a bor vedut, which giving me an access route to get to my pit is not ruining your property. But Gabe Ilan Mishamatle. But with a tree, if my tree is branching out into your property, Milo Mode Rabbi Akiva B'Ilana Nodel Toch Siecha Berosha Kotzetz Malomar Dam Al Gabe Machresha. We saw it much earlier in the Masechet on Daf Kaf Zayin that they're saying, wouldn't Rabbi Akiva agree in the case of a tree? We learned there that if a tree is going into your neighbor's property, this is laws of neighbors from the beginning of the Masechet. My tree is branching out into your field. You can cut it if it's getting in the way of your plow. And when the guy is standing on the plow with his stick, the stick is going to get stuck on the tree. You're allowed to cut it. So what do you see here? If it's actually damaging the property, there's no mocher b'ayin yafa there. So if my tree is branching out over beyond my land into your land, remember, I own this little land around the trees, into your land, it's actually ruining your crops. Why is it ruining your crops? Because it's creating shade. The sun won't get to your crops, your stuff won't grow well. So, of course, in that case, Rabbi Akiva will agree that you're allowed to cut it down, which means I can explain the Mishnah according to Rabbi Akiva, which basically means, even though the Gemara doesn't explain this, but the commentaries do, this basically means that Rabbi Elazar actually disagrees with Shmuel, his rabbi, and apparently disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan, his rabbi, because Rabbi Yochanan, who said you get malo levis salo, is because he thinks mocher b'ayin yafa mocher. The seller who sold you the tree is selling generously and giving you a little more space because that's the space you need to be able to walk around. So obviously you're getting that space and getting an access route, and therefore Rabbi Elazar's question is coming from just a different approach. I don't think you have an access route, and therefore why would you give malo levis salo? But Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel seem to hold that you would get the access route and you would get the malo levis salo. Even though Rabbi Shmuel wasn't talking about a levis salo, but we're assuming if you get an access route, maybe he would agree about that as well. Amalei Abai Rabbi Yosef. Otan oreva salo mizoran. Well, now we're going to say, obviously, the oreva salo has a bit of a different nature than the land you get underneath, because the land you get underneath is completely for your use. You can plant there, do whatever you want. But if already the last sugya just said that the oreva salo is kind of like an access route, so the access route you can't plant on, right? And we're going to get to this. This is the sugya on Daf Tzaditet. So, and we'll quote it here as well. So who gets to plant in the oreva salo area? Amalei Tanitua. So Rav Yosef answers to Abaye, it's a Mishna on Daf Tzaditet. And there it's talking about if my garden, to get to my garden, I have to pass through your garden. There's an inner garden and an outer garden, and there's only one access route through your garden. You have to give me an access route. But that path, the one who lives whose garden it is allowed to plant there. There's all sorts of restrictions I have on that. When I can go in, when I can go out. We'll get to that Mishna on Sadi Tet, but basically you have rights to plant that if you live in the outer garden, you can plant it, and I'm just allowed to walk on your plants, or I might have to go around, right? It makes it a little inconvenient for me, but basically you can plant it. So there you see, must be, if you sold me the trees, the 3 trees, I get the land underneath, and I get the Malo Rebbe Salo, but the Malo Rebbe Salo, I only have rights to walk there. I don't have rights to plant there. So Amalei Midami. No, that's not the same. Because it's not the same as the path, the access path, because there's no loss for me involved in having that access route and not being able to, and you planting there. It doesn't really bother me. But if my crops fall on the ground and they fall onto your wheat, I'm going to get straw and other stuff mixed in with them, and it's going to ruin them. So it's actually bad for me if I let you plant there, and therefore you can't plant there. So it's not the same. And therefore, Abai says, I don't agree with your comparison. And in fact, if you're going to bring up that Mishnah, I think it's more similar to the end of the Mishnah. Halodami ela l'seifa. Zevze einan rishayim l'zara'a. The latter part of the Mishnah talks about a case where we went to court about this, the inner and the outer garden, and we agreed, we came to a compromise agreement that I'm going to go out of my way and walk on a path. We're going to give me an access way on the side so I don't walk right through the middle of your garden. But it's going to be better for me because then no one's going to actually be able to plant there, because also you agreed, number one, and also it's not in the middle of your garden where you usually plant. So it's off to the side. So basically it's this compromise agreement and nobody's allowed to plant there, not you and not me. So he says it's more like that. And Abai thinks that this seems to be more like that case where neither one can plant in the Malo or Salo. So it's not exactly like an access route. It is, but it's not. Last question for today. If you have 3 trees, we consider this like you bought the field, right? And the land underneath. It's as if you have a mini field here. So now the question is, well, if I own, 1 tree here, 1 tree really far away, and a 3rd tree, right, that I bought in your property, and they're really far from each other, obviously we're not going to say I get all the land in between, and these are viewed like one field. And if they're too close, then you can't really, trees won't grow well. So we also don't call that a field. So the question is, what's the exact distance? And for this, we're going to have a debate. Rav Yosef Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. So Rav Yosef quotes Rav Yehuda, who quotes Shmuel, who says, Me'arba amot ad shmone. Minimum, there has to be 4 cubits in between. If it's too close, if it's 2 cubits, doesn't work. Maximum 8. Once it's past 8, it's already not the same field. Amar le Abai le Rav Yosef. Again, Abai says to Rav Yosef, I don't agree with you. Lo tifla galei Rav. Oh, sorry, I skipped the line. Rabba Amar Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel. Notice one was right. These rabbis quoting Shmuel. This is now other rabbis quoting Shmuel. Mishmon avad sheshesrei. Shmuel really said 8 to 16, not 4 to 8. So now comes Abai to Rav Yosef and says, Lo tifla galei to Rav Nachman. Don't disagree with Rav Nachman. It's clear it's 8 to 16. Why? Ditna matnitin kabate, because there's a Mishnah that supports his reading. Ditna. There's a Mishnah in Kilayim. Now, Kilayim, what do we learn? In order for it to be a kerem, you need to have, right, in order for it to be asur midoraita, forbidden by Torah law, it's a kerem, it's a vineyard. Then, if you have a vineyard, it's a proper vineyard, you have to distance yourself 4 cubits before you can plant anything. 4 cubits is the proper distance. But if it's not a vineyard, technically, because you have, let's say, 1 vine, so then you only have to distance 1 cubit because it's not technically a kerem. Now, there's a whole rule about a kerem. In order to be a kerem, it has to have 5 rows, like a 4 in a square formation, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1 is a tail. Many people think it's like centered in between the 2, like further back, almost like a dice with the 5, but the 5 is in behind the 4 dots, okay, not in the middle of it. So anyway, there's a whole debate about how exactly to view those 5, but here that's not what's important. The importance is what's the distance between. So we have 2 options. Either it's a vineyard, then you have to distance 4 cubits, or it's not a vineyard, but it is a vine, and then you only have to distance 1 cubit. So this explains now, if they're so far from each other, okay, we're going to read this. If there's 16 cubits in between rows, you can bring crops and plant them as long as they're 1 amma away, but you don't need the 4 amma because this isn't really a kerem. What do you see? It's 16 amot. That's the main thing. We're just going to read the rest of the Mishnah, though. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Maaseh b'Tzalmon. That was a place. Be'echad shenatat karmo 16 al 16 amah. He did rows, 16, 16, 16 distance. והיה הופך שיער שתי שורות לצדדיו וזורע את הניל. לשנה אחרת היה הופך את השיער למקום הזרע וזרע את הבור. We're going to have a few different interpretations of this. I'm going to go with just the Rashbam. I think it's the Rashbam. I'm going to go with one, which is, imagine row A, B, C, D, E, okay, or A, B, C, D, E, okay, I'm thinking in Hebrew, A, B, C, D, E. Now, A and B face each other, the vines, because vines, remember, they drape over. So he faced A and B toward each other, and then he faced C and D toward each other. So between B and C, it was total open space of 16 cubits. Therefore, he was able to plow a whole field and plant crops in that middle field, as long as, right, it was a 14 cubit field because he kept 1 cubit on each side. And then he did the same thing, right, and so on. And the second year, now, why he did this, whether it was for halachic reasons, some people say, or the Rashbam says it's not for halachic reasons, it's just he did it for plant, for cultivation reasons. The current has a picture, actually, but it's different than the one I'm explaining. So it'll fool you a little bit because that's not the way I'm going with, just so you know. The second year, he did B and C facing each other, and then the space between A and B was free. And D and E facing each other, and between C and D was free. And he did that to basically switch off years so that you would plant crops in the field, in one field, and then the next year, the other field. We saw that people would do that in order to not weaken the land, the soil, so that one year you grow it, one year you would lay fallow. Crop rotation. Thank you. So anyway, that's one way to explain. There are many other ways. You can look at the Quran. They have a totally different explanation. They go with a different commentary. And Bama said, and the rabbi said this was okay. Mainly the issue of because he kept it free from the vineyard and all the vines went the other way, it was a totally open field that he could then plant as long as he left one am on each side. Anyway, the point was that proved the 16. So quick review of today's daf. We start with the Bikurim and the reading, right? Why can't you just read it as if you're reading from the Torah? Then we got to the Geza issue. What's Mina Geza? What's Mina Shavashim? When the sunlight sees it, then we said, well, maybe you could trick people. So then we explained the Mishnah a little differently. You actually have to cut it if it comes from the trunk. Then we had this halach of Rav Nachman, Dekel Ein Lo Geza, and we didn't understand what that meant. Rav Zvid had one explanation. Rav Papa disagreed and gave a different explanation. Then we had to explain where Rav Zvid was coming from and when he even suggested what he suggested. Then we had 3 Kanak Parko. What land do you get? And we talked about the Oreva Salo. And then Rabbi Elazar asked this question, which basically in the end showed that he has a different approach than his rabbis did about Mocher Ba'ayin Yafa or Ayin Ra'ah. And then we finished with these 2 issues, came up as discussions between Abai and Rabbi Yosef about who gets to plant in that area of the Oreva Salo and how much space needs to be between the trees in order to say you acquire the space it's considered a field. So we said in the end, either beyond 8 or beyond 16 is already not a field. And Abai basically tried to prove the second one, which is it must be 16, and asked Rav Yosef, and we'll see what Rav Yosef's retort is tomorrow. With that, we'll finish. Sorry for the break in the middle for my power failure, which I guess was better than the break in the Hebrew class. Some people in the class actually had to break in the middle for sirens. So a busy morning. Wishing everyone a safe day and a Shavua Tov.